Welcome to our third presentation on emails. We're going to jump ahead for a second to the disclaimer. The disclaimer is something that's going to appear at the very end of your email. It's going to be part of your signature block, which will automatically populate in your email. So you don't have to worry about it once you've set it up in the system. Most likely your law firm will already have an email notice that or email disclaimer that it likes. And so you'll just add that to your email. If your law firm is just starting up or it's very small, it's possible that there isn't a standardized one. In that case, I would suggest that you take the lead of your supervisor and use the one that he or she is using. That's the bare minimum in terms of disclaimers. There will be times that you're dealing with a particularly sensitive email that you just have to send by email, or you're dealing with a client who maybe isn't too careful about privilege, that you'd want to include a privilege note on the subject line or at the beginning of the email or possibly at the end of the email. Those are optional and depend upon the circumstances. I wouldn't put those in automatically into emails, but they can be helpful to use in the right circumstances. If you happen to be in a situation in which you just don't feel like that disclaimer is appropriate, you certainly can take it out for an individual email. Um, in many of the email systems, the signature block will populate and you will be able to edit it before you hit the send button. If that's the way your system works, it's easy for you to just go ahead and remove it. For example, if you are discussing lunch plans with a friend or maybe with your significant other, you don't need a disclaimer on it. But it's wise to rarely remove the disclaimer. Now, you might be thinking, do I need the disclaimer when I'm sending it to anyone other than someone within the law firm or my client? For example, there's no privilege with the conversation that I have with opposing counsel or perhaps with a court coordinator. That's true that there's no privilege, but you can still inadvertently send something to the wrong person. And so you still ought to include that disclaimer at all times unless it's purely a personal email. And then you could, if your policies of your law firm permits it, remove it under those circumstances. But there really is no reason to remove the disclaimer simply because you are emailing someone from another law firm. If for no other reason than it's just a hassle to remove it each time. If you think that you want to remove it for whatever reason, and it's not, a lunch invitation or something like that, be sure to talk to the attorney before you do so. Here's an example of a disclaimer. Again, each firm's will be different, and to some extent it will vary depending upon the practice that the law firm does. I find this one rather amusing. This is an Australian law firm that says as its disclaimer, "We do not disclaim anything about this email. We're quite proud of it, really." Um, that's funny, and I get where they're coming from, but most law firms are not going to take this particular vision. So I would not recommend this unless, of course, the attorney has said this is what we want to be using. Okay, so we've talked about the disclaimer that needs to go at the end, but as I said, sometimes you'll want to put it in the subject line. So we have motion for summary judgment, and then we have a pretty long disclaimer. You'll notice in this example that I haven't included client matter information. We would still want to do that. And so I'd probably submit or put it in right here, and we'll say that the matter is SMI 004. It's pretty hard to get all of this in a readable level. If you're going to include privilege and confidential, put it at the end of your subject line so that in systems that only show the first little bit of the email, the reader can at least see, oh, it's about the motion for summary judgment. They don't just see privilege and confidential and not have any idea about what the context is. Let's look here about a way that you might put the information in the body of your email. You can see this is the section that includes a version of a disclaimer but it's not the hyper technical and boring one like this. This is a bit of a more approachable one. Here we go. To maintain the special privileges, yada, yada, yada. This would be good to use for somebody who's unsophisticated or whom you haven't reminded in a while. By putting it in the middle of the email, because the odds of them reading the disclaimer at the end are pretty small, this maybe increases the chances of them reading it. And you want to be careful with this. You don't want to beat them over the head and say, I know you're an idiot, so I'm going to have to tell this to you again. There does need to be some diplomacy here. Keep in mind that email lacks nuance. It doesn't have all those subtle shadings that you would want. And you are kind of sending a negative message here. Hey, stupid person, you don't know how not to forward this message. And so it does require a bit of a gentle touch. So I did it with just a reminder. That is one approach. You could start the email with it, or you could end the email with it. I kind of chose to put it in the middle. And that's kind of a personal preference situation. Now we're going to go ahead to the body of the email. We're kind of done with the disclaimer discussion. So when you start the email, again, this is after the salutation, you should consider, well, does this person have a context for knowing who I am? And this is going to happen pretty commonly. The client may be talking regularly with the attorney, but he or she may not frequently talk with you. You may know lots about the client because you're doing a lot of the work behind the scenes, but the client may have heard very little about you. And so you have to keep that in mind when you are sharing or when you are beginning an email. You want to make this client or this person, whomever it is, feel like they know why they're getting this email and who you are. It's better to err on the side of explanation than not. Obviously, you don't want to explain yourself to someone you're dealing with all the time, so you can certainly carry it to a ridiculous extent. But if you don't think the person will pretty much automatically know you, begin by explaining who you are. Here are two examples that you might approach it. I'm a student in this particular class. Or I am Tom, the paralegal who works with attorney Amanda Green. Those are two very simple ways uh, of kind of identifying yourself. So again, those are some ideas about how to begin it. Then once you've explained who you are, the next thing you need to say is why you're emailing. Yes, you have a subject line, but now you can talk in a little bit more detail about it. This probably works best as a separate paragraph because now you're getting to the main event. You may be concerned, gosh, I thought we couldn't have one-sentence paragraphs. Well, you're right. In a letter, a one-sentence paragraph, unless it's the final sentence, is a no-no. But in an email, it's fine, especially when it's an introduction like that. Keep in mind, we want to have things that make it super easy for the reader to discover what we want to say. So some of our more technical rules in letters we're going to relax for the purposes of making sure we have a good communication. Okay, so here are some examples about what we're looking for. So here we're trying to explain we're corresponding with the instructor, and we want to explain what we need from the instructor. Please let me know when I can meet with you to discuss why. And of course you would say what why is, to discuss chapter 14's assignment or something like that. I have class during your office hours, but I can meet you between this time and this time on Monday and on Tuesday. This is a good strategy when you want to meet with someone, because if you say, hey, let's meet, and you're not suggesting, say, office hours, and this isn't just for instructor emails, suggest some times, because guess what? That's the next thing that's going to be discussed. Oh yeah, I'm happy to meet with you. What time would work for you? Well, I don't know what time will work for you. Well, these times will work for me. Well, that won't work for me. It can end up being 20 emails. And that means that you don't get your answer nearly as quick, and both you and the person, the recipient, have spent a lot of time trying to figure this out. And so try to anticipate the next step in the email progression by sharing some times that would work. So here's another example of how you might begin. I'm emailing you regarding the Smith v. Green case. This works, but you might want to be more specific regarding scheduling the depositions in the Smith v. Green case, for example. And then here's a third. There has been a significant development in the case that needs your immediate attention. Now that's less ideal because it's kind of mysterious. Ooh, what's happened? But again, you may not want to share it because maybe, again, it's privileged or it's confidential. And so that may be the reason that you're being a little cagey. If that's the case, then it's a reasonable reason to be cagey. If you're being cagey to get a little drama going or to motivate the person to email you or call you, not the best approach. So these are just some suggested ways of doing it, of having that next section. You've introduced yourself, now you're explaining what the email topic is. Little reminder, we want to be super brief. The briefer it is, the more likely it is that the person will read it. People don't oftentimes read emails. They skim longer emails. They may read the first sentence, they may have their eyes glaze over the rest of it, but it's pretty common that people don't go down and read. For this reason, this is not the time to say, "How are you? I am fine," or "Boy, I heard a great joke the other day," or "Congratulations on that great promotion." I mean, if that's the whole topic of the email, awesome. But if you're using that for a transition, you need to keep that super, super short or remove it entirely. And again, if you feel like, gosh, I just can't say what I need to say that briefly, okay, no problem. That means that email is not the format. But email is really helpful to schedule the meeting where you can share all that information. A good rule of thumb is if your email is longer than 5 sentences, you probably need to either talk to the person or write a letter. That's not a hard and fast rule, but 5 sentences is probably a pretty good basis for doing that. If you decide not to follow the 5-sentence rule, know in your own mind, I'm not doing it because of this reason. And there are some good reasons why you don't want to do it. But don't just kind of fall into the habit of, oh, I always use email, even though this is a super long issue. Okay, now we're going to talk about the conclusion. This is how we end up closing our email. And many people call this the signature block will work, but also another term for it is the valediction. Vala means well, and diction means spoken. So well spoken is what this means. But this is our closing, our sign-off, basically. You're going to probably use the same sign-off in letters as in emails. And here again, this is going to be part of your signature block. You're not going to be reinventing the wheel. You'll have this every single time. You can consider somewhat more informal choices, but why would you want to? Maybe on your school account, okay, fine. But on your professional account, there will be times that you will want to use very truly yours. And there will be other times where thanks might be just fine. But isn't it nice just to have one that's just always okay, like very truly yours? Then you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to remember to change it. You don't have to actually change it. So my suggestion is to go with sincerely or very truly yours and never look back. Don't worry about it. Don't add something to your list that you don't need to. Or at least it can be your default setting, and when you do feel like you need to tweak it, you can. You always need to have your title in your valediction. That reminds the person, I'm not an attorney. Since you are sending this out under a law firm email, the assumption is anyone sending emails from this account will be an attorney unless there's something in the email that says otherwise. Now, you may say, well, I've covered in the letter that I'm not an attorney. I mentioned that I'm a paralegal, so I don't need to put in my valediction. Well, that's true. You don't have to have it in both places, but are you going to have it in every single email body that you send out? Probably not. So it's good to have it also in your valediction. It's also pretty standard to put one's title, work title, in the valediction. So it's really just a normal, typical thing to do. Um, so we've talked about the file. One thing to watch out for is don't go into deep, funny, or spiritual sayings in this area. You want to keep it professional. Many law firms will have some kind of stylized signature block, maybe with the firm's icon or something along those lines, and that's fine to use. But you will sometimes see people that say "reach for the stars" or things like that. Nah, that's not professional. Keep it to just what you need to have in your email. People will kind of be smirking at you if you do it that way, and you may offend some people by some of the things that you might consider saying. So stick to just the tried and true. In your personal email, go for it. So here are some examples. Very truly yours, and of course this would be on one line with a comma. Then you'd have Mary Smith on the next line, and then you'd have paralegal on the third line. You would not have this, you would have this comma, so keep this comma, but you wouldn't have this comma when the paralegal's on the other line. So it works the same way here. Sincerely, you'll have the comma, you'll go to the next line, Dan Davis. On the next line, you'll have paralegal. You won't keep this comma. Regards, comma, next line, Pat Smith. Remove this comma. On the next line, legal secretary. This is one that you can use in an email if you want to constantly be flipping in and out. When you are corresponding with courts and clients, you do very truly yours. If you're corresponding with people around the office, you do regards. You can do that. It's a lot of work. I wouldn't do it, but you can. Thanks, that works sometimes as well. If you're thanking someone for something, obviously. You'd have thanks, comma, then you'd have Raymond Burr on one line, and then on the next line, if he's the receptionist, you're going to put receptionist. And all these things are going to line up on the left margin. Call me, that's a little bit more informal than I would go with, but okay. Then you're going to have a Hannah Gruen on this line. You're going to get rid of the comma and have paralegal. So these are options, but my strong recommendation is to stick with these two. And for the purposes of our assignment, I do want you to use very truly yours or sincerely. Maintain a professional tone. This is not a personal email. This is not letting your hair down. Yes, it's somewhat more informal, but the law is still a really formal undertaking. And so we're still going to use correct grammar. We're not going to use sentence fragments. We're not going to ditch standard punctuation, standard spelling. We're going to follow all of those rules that we ordinarily would. If grammar isn't your forte, then use the aspects of Microsoft Word that will identify the errors that you have and help you correct them. Some email systems have those things, some don't. So use external tools if that isn't your strong suit. You're only going to want to use standard abbreviations. No, if you're referring to NASA, you don't have to write out the National Aeronautics Space Administration. You can use NASA. But if you want to refer to a deposition, don't say depo in an email. Go ahead and write out the word deposition. Would it be the end of the world if you're corresponding with another paralegal and you type depo? No. But if you get in the habit, you'll find yourself typing out depo when you're sending it to the client. The client has no idea what a depo is. And so you want to go ahead and follow the ordinary rules, at least on this assignment, but I would say as a general rule, go ahead and use that. Avoid slang. Keep your grammar standard. Your email should be approachable with short sentences, but it shouldn't sound like you're engaging in a very casual conversation. No emoticons, no LOLs, none of that type of things. Avoid things like jokes or sarcasm or silliness. Things like that don't sound funny. They sound kind of weird in an email, and people aren't quite sure how to take them. One of the things about jokes is that they are ambiguous. And again, emails are already ambiguous enough without going there. I'm going to say don't use exclamation points at all. So I'm going to say, don't do this. Now, again, if you're emailing your best friend in the office, is it the end of the world if you use an email exclamation point? No. To your client, don't do it though. And so for this assignment, take the more conservative approach. You have to proofread. Even if you're doing it through Word and you've checked it and there's no problems, Word won't find all the errors. And so you need to look for, did I skip a word? Do I have a typo? Is my punctuation correct? Be aware that autocorrect or auto-populate will sometimes do you wrong. If you know more than one Bob and you start typing in Bob, you think you're typing in Bob the client, but you're actually typing in Bob, your next door neighbor. Not a good situation. Proofreading is really hard. It's a good idea to step away from the email, put it in drafts, do something else for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 minutes, and then go back to it. And that way you can approach it with a little bit more of a clean eye and be less likely to to somehow avoid seeing that error that's staring at you. Okay, so it said before, pause before sending. You are creating a permanent record. If you send it to the wrong person, you can't unsend it. If you say something in it that you wish you hadn't said, it's going to be there forever and ever. When you're creating a permanent record, it makes sense to pause before you click submit. Decide, of course, before you end who you're going to CC or BCC, and follow, of course, the practices of your law firm. But of course, the client and the assigning attorney are likely people to consider sending it to. Check the sender's email at least twice before sending. I speak from personal experience. I've inadvertently sent it to the wrong person. You don't want to be there. And then, of course, be sure that you file your email appropriately. You don't want to have to worry about finding an email for 6 months ago. Knowing where it is and being able to retrieve it quickly is a blessing. Let me take my word for it. So now we're going to go to the document here. Here we go. So let's get started with our notes. Again, just be sure you're writing this stuff down because you're going to need it for the assignment, and you're going to you're going to need it for the assignment, and you're going to need it for the quiz that you're about to take. So again, this is just a reminder, your first line, if the person doesn't know who you are, is tell them who you are, because that's going to be their first thought. I'm getting this email. That's my law firm, but I don't know a Teresa. You need to resolve that before you go forward, because they're going to be confused and not really paying attention to what you're saying until you resolve, or to what you're typing, until you resolve that issue. So that's the first order of business. Avoid small talk or humor, dive right into it. Save your jokes for when you're talking to the person in real life. Again, it's fine to have a one-sentence paragraph. Now, I will say that if you have, 4 one-sentence paragraphs, that's getting a little silly. It's going to look odd just visually. But certainly the first sentence and the last sentence can be one sentence. And you may have more than another sentence, especially one that's really important. You may want to use that as a one-sentence paragraph. I think a good idea is no longer than 3 sentences, and these are relatively short sentences. If you're having longer sentences, number one, don't cut them down to size. But if you somehow can't, then 2 sentences may be about as far as you want to go, if you really want the person to read it, and presumably you do, or you wouldn't be writing it. Follow the rule, 1 topic per paragraph. When you write letters, that's a good rule of thumb too. When you write briefs, when you write anything, that's a good rule of thumb. But sometimes you can be a little bit broader, but not in an email, because again, people are skimming emails. And so if you have 2 topics to cover and you have them both in the same paragraph, there's a very good chance the reader's only going to get the first topic. If the particular topic that this email is about is asking them to do something or not do something or send you information, in other words, you're trying to motivate this person to do something, then you are going to want to start the paragraph with that. Again, you don't want to bury what's most important to you. If you want the Social Security, if you need the Social Security numbers of the 3 kids in the household, don't start by saying, I need some, or something like this. We are preparing the answers to the interrogatories. I need Sally, Teresa, and Bob's Social Security numbers. No, because they may not read the second sentence. They may just say, oh, good, they're working on the interrogatories, next paragraph. Lead with that. If you want them to do it, you need to start the sentence with that. Also consider italicizing it or putting it in bold, or perhaps bulleting it. Do not discuss or share confidential information via email. We've already discussed that one. Try to use words like please, thank you, if you wouldn't mind, I appreciate, etc., etc. You don't want to go overboard because they do take length, but you do want to have some of these niceties in your writing. Otherwise, your email will sound very abrupt and terse. If you were talking to the person, you would use these niceties. If you strip away your language to keep it really, really short, and what you're stripping away are the niceties, you very possibly are going to, I don't want to say offend, that may be too strong, but put a little bit of tension in the relationship. That's not good, especially if you want this person to do something for you. We need those niceties. In the body with how and when to contact you with questions. That should be your final sentence, and most of the time that's going to be its own paragraph. Some people even put that as a final sentence in your signature block. That way you don't have to type it every time. Not a bad idea. If you are wanting people to contact you through a telephone number, you're going to want the telephone number in that final sentence, even if you also put it in your signature block. The reason for that is that people, when they're reading emails, are not paying super great attention. They're not probably looking at the signature block. So if you say, please call me, but you don't give them the number, they're not going to know what to do. So go ahead and say, please, if you have questions, please call me, and then put the number. And then put that same number in the signature block. Because some people will look in the signature block and some people will look in the final sentence. And your goal is to get them to know how to contact you. You're not going to be able to cause them to look necessarily where you would ideally want them to look. Okay, read and reread your email to see if you can make it shorter, clearer, and easier for the recipient to understand. And you may think, well, gosh, why am I having to work so hard? You're working hard to save you effort. Because if you don't make it clear, the email you're going to get back is, I don't understand. And then you have to start over. And if you don't make it as transparent, then the person's going to ignore it. Oh, yeah, they just sent me an email. I don't know what it was about. It is for your benefit that you are crossing the I's and dotting the T's. You are saving yourself time in the long run. So that's kind of the thing that you want to keep in mind, that this is actually for you. Spend an extra 5 minutes on the email so that you will have the result that you want. And now we're going to talk about the signature block. So again, the things that we're looking for here is your paralegal status, your contact information, and the disclaimer. Those are the 3 things that are maybe a bit surprising in your things to keep in mind when you are preparing this. So you're going to close with sincerely or very truly yours. You can have a blank space before your name or not. That's for you to decide. You're going to want to have your first name and your last name. That will go on the next line that you have typing on. Some people like to have a wet signature file, want something that looks more like handwriting below their type name or above their type name. You certainly can add that if you would like to. If you go by a nickname and you prefer to have that, you can use that, or you can go with your formal name. On the next line, you'll have your title. Again, that's important to include for sure. You'll want to have your firm information. It's going to include the name of the firm, the address, and by this I mean the street address, the telephone number, the facsimile. Also, you should include your email address. Again, it's available if obviously if they've successfully received an email from you, they can see your email address there. But it's kind of nice to have one-stop shopping with all that information. You can also include the firm's website and some kind of other information if you would like, but it's not absolutely required. Always end with the firm disclaimer, but don't put it in quotation marks. It's not a quote, it's just a disclaimer. Again, you're going to want to use the one that your firm is using. Actually, we'll see one of those in just a few minutes. Do not end a line of the signature block with a comma. So when you are putting your name, and then maybe the next line you're having your title, if the title is going on at the line below, and that's where it does belong, don't put a comma. So it's not Mary Smith, comma, next line, paralegal. It's Mary Smith, next line, paralegal. And here's an example of what yours is going to look like, or what one might look like. Very true to the years. I left a space here. You don't have to, but people kind of expect to see that. And then I have senior paralegal on the next line. I have the name of the firm, its physical street address, and of course its city and state. Here's my direct line. You could also just have the firm number here, and then also the facsimile number. And then here's where the disclaimer would go. Some disclaimers start with the word disclaimer, some don't. Obviously, if yours doesn't start with the word disclaimer, don't put disclaimer. You just copy and paste it directly into the document. Let's look at an example of an email that a person might send and go through what's wrong about it, what's right about it, and how we can fix it. Well, the first thing I see is that this person did do it in block format, so that's good. Everything is on the left margin, positive. So now we're going to need to work on the subject line. The first thing I notice is that we didn't capitalize case. We don't need to capitalize on or the, but we do need to capitalize case as a major word. Then we also need the client identifier. So I'm going to say this is RED-432. Usually you're going to put this in parentheses. This subject line, though, is pretty vague. Details on the case. So I'm going to change this to deposition details for the case. I might even be more specific and say deposition details for Larry Green. Okay, so we now have a subject line that we're happy with, and now we're going to go to our salutation. Several problems here. We always start with dear, and we're always, since it's clearly a business one, we're going to end with the colon. Again, we make that by hitting the shift button and by typing the key that is to the right of the L key. I'm going to assume that we know this person pretty well, so we're going to stay with Bob. Okay, this is small talk. It's lovely to share this, but we don't need it in our email. It's a distraction. If you really feel like you need it, end your email with it. That's the space that people aren't going to read. Since we're not doing our introduction, there's no need to start with anyway. We don't use contractions in legal writing. Contractions are perfectly good for spoken English and for informal English, but not for writing. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean up all of our contractions. and get those done. I'm going to suggest that you stop using contractions in your writing because many of us have this habit where we use contractions all the time, and it's really hard to get out of it if we're used to it. So it's a good idea to just go ahead and get out of the habit of using contractions. I am emailing about the Smith case. Well, obviously we know Bob pretty well because we're using Bob. And it may be necessary, maybe this is opposing counsel. So we may need to identify what the case is about. I'm going to underline it because we want to identify cases by italicizing, kind of like we would titles of books. Now we'll assume this is opposing counsel, and we can see that this is something that we don't want to share really at all, but certainly not in a written document. My client is a bit high maintenance, so I am having some difficulty getting her to commit to a depot date. Several problems here. For one thing, we misspelled maintenance, right? And for another thing, we're using an abbreviation, okay? Why is it still, am I still misspelling it? Maybe I don't know how to spell it. Here we go, I guess it's okay now. Okay. So we don't want to share this kind of stuff with anyone really in an email. I mean, within the office, do people talk this way? Sure, but it's not a great place to put this. So I'm just going to remove this whole sentence. For one thing, it's not necessary to can you give me some dates that work for you? So I'm asking him to do something. So I'm going to put that on another line because I'm making a request. A lot of times I also put this in bold. Appreciate it. This is a fragment. We need to say, I appreciate it. Again, that's adding some length, but it may be worth it depending upon your relationship. Now you can see we jump into another topic. Also, I'm checking on your client's response to the settlement offer. It has, been a while, and Attorney Anderson is antsy for an answer. So we're going to need to start a new paragraph because this is a new topic. Let's remove the also. I am checking on your client's response to the settlement offer. That's one way of saying it. You could also just say is what is your client's response to the settlement offer? It has been a while and Attorney Anderson is antsy for a response. I'm going to keep it shorter and just say Attorney Anderson is antsy for a response. That's a little bit informal. I'll say is interested in your client's response. We don't use attorney as a title, so we're going to switch this to Ms. Anderson or Mr. Anderson or whomever. Let's get together sometime soon, maybe for lunch. I would love to see the pics from Hawaii. Again, we would say the pictures, not the pics, but this is small talk. You can call them up and talk about that. When you have this information, please feel free to email me. C. Smith at gordonharris.com or call me 214-994-1234. Best is a little bit informal to be giving to the other side, so I'm going to go with sincerely. And again, you'll have the whole signature block. So Cynthia Smith, And then you would add paralegal and all of the rest of the stuff. Now I can see from the body that the way I named this email initially wasn't very appropriate. So let's go ahead and change this. For one thing, my subject line didn't alert Bob to the fact that I need him to do something. In fact, it suggested that I'm giving him some detail. So I would start by need depot dates and need settlement response. I'm going to proof it just to make sure I haven't missed any issues. Ray, need deposition dates and need settlement response. Dear Bob, I am emailing about the Smith case. Can you give me some dates that would work for you for Larry Green's deposition? I appreciate it. I'm also checking on your client's response to the settlement offer. Ms. Anderson is interested in your client's response. Hopefully that's clear enough. You might tweak that, but this is also a little bit more gracious than what is your client's response. So I'm going to let that one fly because this email is ending up being pretty short. When you have this information, please feel free to email me or call me. I'm just going to say please email or call me. Sincerely, etc. I feel like we now have a good email and we have completed our notes. If you missed some of the notes at some point, I'm going to go through it slowly and you can take a picture and type it up. Pause me if you need to. Well, thank you for your attention. We are now done with emails. Have a wonderful day.